day to each and every one of you. So I am Riniel Josh Dakanay from the Group 5 and I am the fourth reporter. And today I am going to discuss about learners with difficulty communicating. So let's get started. Learners with difficulty communicating are students who face challenges in expressing their thoughts, needs, or understanding others. So some learners are observed to have difficulty communicating, either verbally expressing their ideas and needs or in understanding what others are saying. Some may have or had a clinical diagnosis of a disability while others display developmental delays and difficulty in the speech and language domain. So today, we are going to discuss this because in inclusive learning, as a future educator, we must understand those who are learners with this special. So there are different disabilities that are associated to communication disorder. So there are two, which is speech impairment and language disorder. But before we proceed to our formal discussion, first we should define those unknown definitions, no? So that mas maintindihan natin yung mga susunod na topic or yung ating formal na topic. So, Hayward of 2013 defined communication as the interactive exchange of information, ideas, feelings, needs, and desires between and among people. So, communication is used to serve several functions, particularly to narrate, explain, inform, request, and express feelings and opinions. So sa atin, ang pagkakalam naman natin sa communication is yung usual na merong receiver and may sender. And by exchanging their thoughts, then nakakabuo tayo ng what we call communication. Moving on to next, which is speech. So speech is the expression of language. Okay, bago tayo mag-proceed sa speech, unahin natin si language kasi ginamit siya sa speech. So language is used for communication, a formalized code used by a group of people to communicate with one another. That is primarily arbitrary. So people decides on symbols, their corresponding meaning, and rules that make up a language. So there are 5 dimensions of language that describe its form, which is phonology, morphology, syntax, content, and pragmatics. But before we proceed to that 5 dimension, we first should define what is speech. So speech is the expression of language with sounds or oral production. So speech is produced through precise physiological and neuromuscular coordination, which is first respiration or act of breathing. So yun yung pagkakaiba niya sa language. Ang language lang kasi is yun yung known na pag-uusap ng isang tribo, ng isang community, or for example, buong Pilipinas, Filipino. That is language, yung ginagamit natin. Pero sa speech naman, there are 3 coordinations that we should observe, which is first, the respiration or the act of breathing. Second one is phonation, or the production of sounds by the larynx and vocal folds. And the third one is the articulation, or the use of lips, tongue, teeth, and hard and soft palates to speak. So basically, it is a language that you are manipulating. That is speech. Now, moving on to the components of language. Starting with phonology. So phonology refers to the sound system of a language. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sounds within a language. For instance, for example, the word dog, diba, is made up of 3 phonemes, namely D, O, G. While beans has 4 phonemes, which is B, in, ns, ganon. Yung, sa tunog niya lang, for example, dog, diog, ganon. Beans, beans. So, 4. Yun yung may example natin dyan. Next, morphology. So, morphology of a language refers to the smallest unit of language that has meaning and which are used to combine words. Sounds, syllables, or whole words are example of morphemes or yung tinatawag natin sa morphology. Medyo hawig siya sa phonology pero dito naman is accordance na siya with sounds, syllables, or the whole words itself. Now moving on to syntax. So syntax is the system of rules governing the meaningful arrangement of words. which also include grammar rules. For instance, for example, the sentence is ready, get for the exam, which does not make any sense, di ba? Until you arrange it in the right sequence as get ready for the exam. So that's an example of syntax. Next one is semantics. So semantics refers to the meaning associated with words and combination of words in a language. This also includes vocabulary, concept development, and connotative meaning of words and categories. And last one is pragmatics. So pragmatics revolves around the social use of language, knowing what, when, and how to communicate and use language in specific context. There are three kinds of pragmatic skills. First is using language for different purposes. For example, narrating, explaining, requesting, and etc. Second one is changing language according to the context. For example, is talking to a peer as compared to speaking to a well-respected professor. And the third one is following rules for conversations and storytelling. For example, taking turns, rephrasing when unclear, how to use facial expression, and eye contact. So knowing those terms is necessarily to understand the different disabilities that are associated with communication disorders. So, of course, we have, there are two, which is speech impairment and language disorders. So, we will start at speech impairments. So, speech impairments are communication disorders such as stuttering, impaired articulation, and language or voice impairments. So, such disorders are significant enough that they can adversely affect a student's academic performance. So, there are four basic types of speech impairments, which is the articulation, phonological, fluency, and voice disorder. So, first is articulation disorder. So, here, a child is unable to produce a given sound physically. Severe articulation disorder may render a child's speech unintelligible. Examples are substitution, omissions, distortions, and addition of speech sound. So, I'll give you a specific example, no? So, yung child, ang gusto niya sabihin is, I want a blue lollipop. Pero, kapag meron siyang articulation disorder, ang pagkakasabi niya dito is, I want a blue lollipop. So, makakabuo siya ng mga words, pero hindi lahat. Meron siyang nahihirapan. Which is here, mahirapan siyang mag-pronounce ng L. No, specific letter L. I want a blue lollipop instead of I want a blue lollipop. So another example is can I get a 3 bananas? And I get a 3 bananas. Ganon. Mahirapan siya mag-articulate ng some letters. So that's articulation disorder. Next one is phonological disorders. So here a child produces multiple patterns of sound errors with obvious impairment of intelligibility. So there is also noted inconsistent misarticulation of sounds, which is sometimes a child is able to articulate it but not in other words. So here a specific example ulit tayo. So for example, ang gustong sabihin ng bata is that pie is good. Pero ang pagbasa niya is cat pie is good. So basically makakabuo siya ng mga words pero hindi siya tugma sa gusto niyang sabihin. So that's an example of phonological disorder. Next one is fluency disorder. So here as a learner or difficulties with he or she having a difficulties with the rhythm and timing of the speech. Stuttering is an example marked by rapid fire repetitions of consonant and or vowel sound especially at the beginning of words. Prolongation, hesitations, interjections, and complete verbal blocks. So, meron siyang gustong sabihin. Like for example, I want a banana. Pero pagbabasahin niya, I want a banana. Yun, medyo matagal niya mabuo kasi meron siyang fluency disorder. Another example which is yung prolongation, which is I want a banana. So that's another sign of fluency disorder. And also repetitions, which is I want a banana, which is repetition of rhythm. So that's a sign of having a fluency disorder. And lastly is voice disorder. So problems with quality or use of one's voices resulting from disorder of the larynx. So voice may be excessively hoarse, breathy or too high pitch. So dito na yung voice niya lang yung mapapansin mo dito. Pag paiba-iba, nahirapan siya maglabas ng voice niya. So that's a sign of having a voice disorder. So moving on to the next disability, which is language disorders. So here, it involves problem in one or more of the 5 components of language and are often classified as expressive or receptive. So yung kanina yung binanggit ko yung 5 components. Kapag may meron siyang difficulty doon sa 5 na yon, then he or she can be considered as having a language disorder. And language disorders are classified into 2, which is expressive or receptive. So language disorders are characterized by persistent difficulties in acquiring use of language that results from deficits in comprehension that include reduced vocabulary, limited sentence structure, and impairment in discourse that limits a child functioning. So to receive a diagnosis of language disorder, the difficulties must not be due to an accompanying medical or neurological condition and other developmental disability. So there are different types of language disorders, which is expressive, nabanggit ko na, receptive, and a combination of 2, which is expressive and receptive. So when we say expressive language disorder, it interferes with the production of language. So a child may have a very limited vocabulary that impacts communication skills or misuses words and phrases in sentence. On the other hand, a receptive language disorder interferes with the understanding of language. A child may have difficulty understanding spoken sentence or following directions a teacher gives. Some children may be found to have a combination of receptive and expressive language disorder. So at this point, it is also essential to mention that students with autism spectrum disorder or ASD also display speech and language difficulties. So autism spectrum disorder is an umbrella term for related disorders that affect social development and communication. Students with ASD display a triad of impairments in social relationship, social communication, and social understanding. Other disorders that are subsumed under ASD are Rett syndromes, pervasive developmental disorder, and Asperger's syndromes. So now moving on to B, which is identification. So communication difficulty is oftentimes one of the most red flags observed by family members, daycare workers, and early childhood teachers. Noted absence, delays, and difficulties in speech or language often prompt family members to consult their general pediatrician, who then makes referral to developmental pediatrician and other specialists. So to screen children with communication difficulties, early childhood professionals use questionnaires and developmental checklists to determine the severity of the delays compared with typical language development. Upon screening, a child may receive educational support and accommodations to help address the delay. If the difficulty is pronounced, referral can already be made to developmental pediatrician and speech and language pathologists. At times, referrals are also made to an occupational therapist if speech difficulty is resulting from motor problems. So how do specialists determine a speech and language problem? So a comprehensive speech and language evaluation to determine the presence of a communication disorder involves several components. Starting with number 1, case history and physical examination. So assessment always begin with the case history that provides the specialist the necessary background about the child's birth and developmental history, health records, achievement test scores, and adjustment in school. The specialist examines the child's oral peripheral mechanism, which includes the mouth, noting irregularities in the tongue, lips, teeth, palate, or other structures that may affect speech production. Second one, hearing. So hearing is tested to determine whether an organic hearing problem is the cause of the suspected communication disorder. As discussed in the previous section, does hearing impairment need to be treated to develop speech and language disorder? Third one, articulation. So a child's articulation skills are assessed, which includes identifying speech error. Fourth one, phonological awareness and processing. Phonological awareness and processing skills provide the foundation for beginning to read in young children. Children with difficulties in processing sounds in language as well as in hearing, segmenting, and identifying phonemes in words may experience problems with expressive and receptive spoken language as well as in learning how to read. Next, overall language development and vocabulary. Formal tests may be used to measure a child's overall language development and vocabulary, as this affects how well a child is able to understand and use language in spontaneous speech and in academic setting. Sixth is assessment of language function. Language is used to serve several functions such as to request, name, imitate, ask, and converse among others. Last is language samples and observation in natural settings. Excuse me. So language difficulties may also be identified through play-based, authentic assessment where specialists play with a child during which spontaneous speech and verbalization can be elicited. Observations in natural settings such as a child home or school allows the specialist to sample the child's language in daily activities and observe parent and child interaction and communication as part of holistic assessment. These are used to supplement assessment information gathered in clinical setting. So, in conclusion, assessment in speech, language, and communication must take into considerations the student's cultural and language context, particularly children growing up in a bilingual environment. As at this point, it is essential to differentiate English language learners from children with diagnosed diagnosed communication disorder. ELLs are proficient in their mother tongue or first language in both expressive and receptive language tasks. On the other hand, they display difficulties in understanding and speaking the second language, such as English. In a multicultural setting, knowing the child's first and second language aids teacher and language specialist to determine the possible sources of communication difficulties and plan for needed support and interventions. All English language learners is put at a disadvantage when his or her first language is not identified and assessed solely in the second language. So that concludes my part. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. And for the next, which is the learning characteristics and general educational adaptations about learners with communication disorder, will be discussed by Dato J. Pilot. So, Mr. Dato J. Pilot, the spotlight is yours. Bye-bye!